Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Luan Ismail. I'm the Executive Director of the Convergence Science Network, and on behalf of its partners, it's my very great pleasure to welcome you this evening to our event, The Next Pandemic, a Hypothetical, which is being brought to you in partnership with the Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity and the Club Melbourne Ambassador Program. The mission of the Convergence Science Network is to provide the public with an opportunity to hear leading scientists and thought leaders discuss how biomedical research is addressing many of the health issues impacting Australians and the world population generally. It's important for scientists to talk about their ideas, their research, and with the public, and it's also important that this process builds trust in science and scientists. So essentially that's what the Convergence Science Network is trying to achieve. The video you've just seen is from one of tonight's sponsors, the Club Melbourne Ambassador Program, and it was shot during the last International AIDS Conference held here at the Melbourne Convention and Exhibition Centre in 2014, and features Club Melbourne ambassadors, some of whom were centrally involved in bringing the conference to Melbourne, and will be sitting on our panel tonight. AIDS 2014 is a clear example of the importance of Melbourne hosting international conferences in the fight against global pandemics. It's now my great pleasure to invite Professor Elizabeth Hartland, Deputy Director of the Doherty Institute for Infection and Immunity, to introduce this evening's outstanding panel. Elizabeth.
So thank you for the introduction and welcome again to tonight's event, The Next Pandemic. We're really delighted to be partnering with Convergence Science Network for this evening's event, and I'd also like to thank the sponsors that have made this event possible, the Club Melbourne Ambassador Program. So over the next hour and a half, with our expert moderator and panellists that I'll introduce very shortly, we'll be exploring the multitude of issues that are associated with preventing and responding to a disease pandemic at a local, national and global level. And at the Doherty Institute, this is something that we grapple with on a daily basis. Our institute is a joint venture between the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital, and it brings together more than 700 staff who are experts in infectious diseases and immunology. And this ranges from the scientists in our laboratories who are handling dangerous infectious agents to clinicians who are treating patients. And our team undertakes a broad spectrum of activities and includes discovery research, developing new ways to prevent, treat and eliminate infections, and also diagnose diseases and undertake surveillance and investigation of disease outbreaks. So let me introduce now our moderator and panel, these learned guests. So our moderator this evening is Dr. Norman Swan. He hosts the Health Report on ABC Radio National and Tonic on ABC News 24, has won many awards for his work, including Australia's top prize for journalism, the Gold Walkley Award. And then to our panellists, firstly, Laureate Professor Peter Doherty, who is the patron and namesake, of course, of the Doherty Institute. And Peter has been involved in research in infection and immunity for 50 years, and as we know, shared the Nobel Prize in Physiology of Medicine in 1996 with Swiss colleague Rolf Zinkernagel for their discoveries concerning the specificity of cell-mediated immune defence and the biological role of major histocompatibility complex. Professor Sharon Lewin is the director of the Doherty Institute. She's an internationally renowned researcher in HIV cure and infectious diseases physician. She leads a large multidisciplinary research team at the Doherty Institute that focuses on understanding why HIV persists, on treatment and developing clinical trials aimed at ultimately finding a cure for HIV infection. Professor Jeremy Sugarman is the Harvey M. Meyerhoff Professor of Bioethics and Medicine at the Johns Hopkins Berman Institute of Bioethics in the US. He's an internationally recognised leader in the field of biomedical ethics, with particular expertise in the application of empirical methods and evidence-based standards for the evaluation and analysis of bioethical issues. Neil Mitchell is the host of 3AW Mornings and is one of Australia's most respected and experienced journalists. He's in his 30th year in radio and has hosted Melbourne's leading morning current affairs program since 1990. He was awarded the Order of Australia for his charity work and services to journalism. And Dr. Stuart Condon was elected to Médecins Sans Frontières Australia Board in May 2011, was elected president in June 2014. He's a medical generalist with a diploma in paediatrics and has done various field placements with Médecins Sans Frontières since 2004. And then last but not least, Michael Moore is the Chief Executive Officer of the Public Health Association of Australia and is the President-elect and currently Vice President of the World Federation of Public Health Associations. Michael is a former Minister of Health and Community Care and was an independent member of the Australian Capital Territory Legislative Assembly for 4 terms, from 1989 to 2001. So you can see that here we have a wealth of knowledge in the brains of our panellists, and to take advantage of this, we will allow some time at the conclusion of the panel conversation for audience questions. And now over to you, Norman.
Thanks very much, Elizabeth, and welcome everybody. Thanks for giving up your time to come along this evening for this important issue which never seems to go away. Neil, you'd have seen a few pandemics in your time?
Have I? What?
Well, certainly one's confected or real. I mean, you've seen HIV, you've been worried about the flu. I mean, when you go out to the audience, what's your sense of community fear, if any, about pandemics?
Oh, it's significant, because it wouldn't be news if it wasn't, sadly. It's significant. They will relate it to their own children, their own lives, and that pretty much is what media is about, communicating to them something that can touch their lives. And no matter how remote it might seem, they will relate that to their own lives.
But the risk is that fear runs away with you, isn't it?
Yep.
Stigma comes in.
Fear sells. Sex sells too, but fear does sell.
And sometimes they come together in the same pandemic, unfortunately.
So I've heard, yeah.
Peter Doherty, what is a pandemic? I mean, I remember, just before I answer the question, I remember Rennie Rifkin, the entrepreneur and investor, during one of our many crashes, financial crashes, being asked by Geraldine Doog, what's the difference between a crash and a correction? And he said, a correction is when you lose money and a crash is when I lose money. What's a pandemic?
Well, a pandemic, actually the definition is not very good, but so not to be obscure, a pandemic is essentially a new infection that goes everywhere, goes all around the world. Whereas an epidemic is something that's generally more localised. And of course, we also have a situation like AIDS, where we really have a continuing pandemic, which has been going since 1981.
Does it have to be large? I mean, we were worried about a flu pandemic a few years ago. It went around the world, but it was small.
I think the definitions are probably a little bit blurred between outbreak, epidemic, pandemic, and it's usually on the scale. So pandemic usually means large, so infecting a lot of people in a lot of different places.
Norman, that's one of the confusions. The 2009 swine influenza pandemic was a big pandemic. It went everywhere. The virus was enormously infectious. It's just that it didn't cause a lot of severe disease, except in some communities, like our Indigenous community, in poorer communities in India and so forth. So that's one of the confusions, really, because pandemic really just means an infection that goes everywhere. It doesn't necessarily mean a terrible infection, but that's the way people interpret it.
So it doesn't give Neil his headlines?
No.
Always.
For instance, we get regular norovirus pandemics. Do you know what a norovirus is? This is the one that when you get on a cruise ship and everyone gets infected,
it's the one that gives you the
you
shits.
think you're going to die, and you don't. You get better. But those viruses change, and regularly there are new variants that go all around the world. So we get these pandemics, but nobody ever talks about them as pandemics, except the people who work on noroviruses.
Michael Moore, you're interested in the conjunction of circumstances that brings about an epidemic. So it's not just the biology of the bug.
It's not. And actually, we really touched on it a minute ago. The real issue is that mostly these things are discussed by those of us who are middle-class people, whereas actually those who suffer most are those who are most vulnerable. And often, as in Australia, that'll be Indigenous people. In West Africa, when Ebola hit, the reason it spread so much was because of the vulnerability of the people, because of the poverty, actually, that drives the pandemic. So to think that you can work just in infectious diseases is very naive. And add to that the politics of it. So the politics of it are how much you're going to be questioned on the radio, how much money have we got that actually this hasn't been budgeted for, and how is it going to be dealt with?
So you were one of the first people to speak out about Ebola in Australia. Just tell the story.
Well, actually what happened was I was approached by a bureaucrat who couldn't speak himself on the issue and said, really, we need to be doing something like this. I said, why? And he explained that actually it wasn't about what was happening in Australia, it was about what was happening in West Africa, and same thing I've just said around vulnerability. And so we immediately put out a press release.
Of course.
Of course. And to say to the government, you're actually not doing enough. Peter Dutton actually phoned me and said, he was the minister at the time, as you recall, and said, I'm doing everything that the Chief Medical Officer asks, and we've already put $1.5 million in. And I said, it's a pittance, Peter, that actually this is not about Australia. We were not critical in our press release about Australia. And so we were having sort of this sideways conversation. He's saying, I'm doing everything we need to do in Australia, which, by the way, I think was largely true. But actually we were saying, no, this is about what's happening in West Africa. And look, yes, we were very early to put it out. Medicine Sans Frontières was in there, I think, earlier. We were just very public about it.
But why couldn't the bureaucrat speak publicly? Presumably it wasn't a junior bureaucrat. Why wouldn't they empower him? Why leave it to a minister?
Because they were being really critical of government. And bureaucrats are probably trying very hard, in fact in this case, was trying very hard to go through government channels. And we love our pincer movements, don't we? So I have about 2,000 members.
Well, we're talking about Ebola and we're worried about sensitivities of bureaucrats and government.
But we're talking about Ebola that really was a big problem in West Africa, not a big problem in Australia, and we hadn't budgeted for it. So we're also, precisely. So we're always talking in politics about where's the money coming from, how's it going to be spent, where are you going to get it from?
It's a fair point, though, that Neil's making, Jeremy, is that we seem to sacrifice our ethical values for politics and our careers.
So there is this divide, right? The ethics and the politics. Aristotle had separate books to describe them. But what we find is, in reality, it's critical to remember what the ethical roots are and what our obligations are. We live in a global world. And diseases travel globally for a variety of reasons, sometimes human to human, but also with all the goods and things that travel globally, something doesn't solely affect just one place.
So talk us through the Ebola story and where values count here. Because Michael's talking here about, we won't pick on this poor bureaucrat, well, he wouldn't have been poor, but this bureaucrat.
I actually made a big strike to make a difference in reality.
But the issues were local, and the issues were about not enough investment in things like primary care. I mean, we only got worried about primary care in West Africa when we were threatened.
Right, so we look at it in different ways. What's our obligation? What was the world's obligation when we see suffering of some sort taking place in a place that seems to be far away? Is one set of moral obligations. What are our obligations to help? Those of us that have the expertise in science, in medicine, in building infrastructures and capacity have a moral obligation to provide some kind of assistance. That's just the common decency, the notion of charity. On the other hand, it's naive to believe that it is only for the good of others, because it ultimately becomes good of the self in terms of an entire nation and all nations that share responsibility. Doctors from Australia and nurses from Australia were going to go provide service in these places because of personal obligations. There were going to be movements, again, as I mentioned earlier, across international borders that were going to then pose some risks to the people who go, the citizens who were there, the people that come back. That opens up another set of discussions for either the poor bureaucrat or the rich bureaucrat.
But let's just go a bit deeper into this, and we'll come back to other epidemics in a moment. I mean, Stuart, you work in primary care as well in Australia and overseas. Médecins Sans Frontières, when we talk about primary care, we're talking about first responders in the community. It has different meanings around the world. I mean, the failure in Ebola was cultural, and there was no general practice system that we're used to here. There was nobody to actually look after care in the community. So we panic, and we sort of put on band-aids, like sending out brave nurses and doctors to do clinics, which is great. But it's over. Are we doing anything? We're not doing anything about primary care in West Africa. It's all. We're relieved that Ebola's gone.
Exactly, and that's one of the lessons that we do need to understand out of what happened in West Africa, that it was about health systems. It wasn't about an infectious disease, it was about what happened in an extremely vulnerable population in 3 different countries who'd been exposed to civil war, had no health systems to support primary healthcare and secondary healthcare. As a result, you saw one of the biggest outbreaks handled badly, numbers of people dying, and then you had to respond to it. So already we were behind the 8 ball.
But
And
it's
don't forget,
also
no clean water and sanitation as, as well.
right.
But I think, you must say that the Médecins Sans Frontières is the organisation that handled it. And they did so amazingly, considering the resources they have and the type of organisation they are. What happened there was partly that the international community dropped the ball and the World Health Organisation dropped the ball.
And it was an interesting test for the international health regulations as well. These are regulations that were changed in 2005, trying to set a framework for how the WHO and the member states can work together in a situation like this. And the international community failed. The international health regulations didn't support a good response, but even arguably they didn't support a good surveillance of what was happening until cases had made it to the UK or to the US.
The great irony, we look down on countries like Cuba, and yet they'd put over 200 GPs on the ground very, very early in the piece. So sometimes it's those other political middle class. Where are we looking? Are they as important as other people until, as you say, somebody arrives?
I think one thing in the Australian response that really, and this gets back to the idea of ethics and what's the right thing to do or not, was heavily influenced by the fact it was West Africa. It just was so far away for us. If that had happened in Papua New Guinea or Indonesia, the Australian government would have had a totally different response, I suspect.
Actually, we pushed them to send our AUSMAT teams, and their response was, no, we need to keep our AUSMAT team here in case the infection moves to New Guinea or one of our near neighbours. And actually there's some sense in that.
Well, that's right. It's the self-interest I'm talking about.
Well, Neil, you talk to politicians all the time. The question is, how broad is the self-interest? Because a lot of these epidemics start in poor countries and then come, or in theory, can come to our borders. The extent to which we as a community should be for self-interest, increasing health infrastructure in those countries.
Well, my view is fairly cynical that self-interest is all powerful with politicians. And that means that they will manage a pandemic or anything else with that uppermost in their mind. And the concerns will not be the people of Africa, but what the people in this country think about what they do about the issue, if it's protecting our own borders, or if it's argued sufficiently whether they have to send the teams into Africa.
I mean, Ebola never was a threat in a country like ours, where we have modern medical services, everyone understands what's going on, we have good communication, all those things. It wasn't a threat to us. If it had got into Papua New Guinea, though, that could have been a problem for us as a regional problem.
And so that's why we had to try and put the pressure on the minister that you're failing in your role, but it was actually about international, not about Australia.
So both of these tensions are real. So people in positions of authority to make decisions about resource allocation have an obligation to do priority setting in a way that takes the pulse of the things that are going on in each of those places. Because had things changed, had an outbreak occurred closer to Australia or in Australia, people have said, well, why did you send them away? Why are they there? And so not knowing, it's easy to always to look backwards and say, oh, we did the right thing, we did the wrong thing. But at the time you're making a decision, one has to think about what resources do we have to bring to bear? What additional resources could we garner in case things become worse? And how do you properly field those resources appropriately? And so those obligations of priority setting are very tough. And what we learned from Ebola was that the local governments and the local authorities made some mistakes of priority setting that also fueled the epidemic. So,
except Nigeria, interestingly.
Yes.
Nigeria was the exception which you think of as a chaotic country, and they seem to have got it right. What was it they got right, Stuart? Can you remember?
I don't know how they did it. I really don't. When I heard cases were being found in Lagos, I was quite terrified. And that was it wasn't even towards the peak of that year. It seems like they rallied enough people around, got the experts to go and help them in a very timely fashion. And it seems like they're able to shut it down very quickly.
Sharon, the scientific response was quite impressive. What happened? I mean, do we have a vaccine yet? Do we have a treatment? What was the upshot in the end?
Yeah, so the scientific response was impressive. I'd say the US played a really key role there. There were some candidate antivirals that had already been developed by a number of companies in Canada and the US. And by the time, one very interesting thing, and Jeremy might want to talk about this, is how you roll out experimental treatments in the setting of an outbreak. What's ethical of how you design a study that you think works, but you haven't yet proven it works. So normally if we have a new treatment and we want to know if it works, we will do what's called a placebo-controlled trial, where you give a dummy pill to one half of the participants and the real drug to the other, and work out if something works. But if you're in the middle of an epidemic and you've got something you think could work, is it ethical just to roll it out?
Or if I arrived back in New York City with Ebola, stuff that, giving me the drug.
Yeah, that's right.
I think this was key. Do you want to go?
No, go ahead.
This is really a key issue, because what we knew from the people that were treated in the United States, the handful of people that were treated for Ebola, that with very intensive care and really first-rate medical treatment, we could get almost all of those people through that illness. That level of intensive care is not available globally. It's not available to most people around the globe, and so that was not a solution. So the idea is, what can we do to treat Ebola? And frankly, scientifically, medically, we didn't know. We still don't know precisely what's the best approach. People had candidate interventions that could work, and each of the proponents of that sort of science or vaccine or intervention said this should work, but we don't really know as a scientific matter, does it work? And the way we typically, our typical default process is to do research. The easiest way to do research and show that something actually works compared to something that doesn't is to compare it to placebo. Globally, we have a problem with placebo. There's a New Yorker, I don't know if you've seen the New Yorker magazine. I know this is Melbourne, but New Yorker magazine had a cartoon I actually understood. These are very difficult to understand. So it always challenge you, and it said, there was a tombstone, and it said, Hiram S. Walker, 1960 to 1985, member placebo group. So the idea that if you receive the placebo, you would be worse off. Yet, in fact, with some of the things that could be tried, and several of the medications and vaccines and products that we bring to market, sometimes it's better to be in the placebo group.
Yeah.
So the question is,
you
which
know, you know, I'd have product test group on the tombstone, do you?
so you probably should.
France or Northwick Park.
But anyway, that piece drove people, this led to an international debate, which is not over with Ebola. And it was in HIV, we've seen the same arguments, and in multiple settings. But for Ebola, you had an emergency situation where people were becoming infected. I have something promising. Should we try it? Should we use a placebo or not? And this fueled an international crisis of how we know.
But we had the same debate during HIV, where people living with HIV said, well, I'm sorry, give me the drug. And people had to think of new ways of testing medications. We'll come to you in a second, Sharon, on that.
Yeah, I think when everyone's dying, you don't need a placebo group, basically. Yeah. That's kind of ridiculous. But basically, by about 2008, as I recall, I was on a committee in the US. There were Ebola vaccines in an advanced stage of non-human testing, non-human primate testing. We could have had drugs and vaccines that had gone through at least safety testing, which is a phase 1 trial, which had gone through to, in the case of vaccines, had gone through to the stage where you could test whether it made a good antibody response, a good immune response. But that wasn't done, and part of the problem is that while many vaccines and therapies are developed under the auspices of publicly funded science, or in the pharmaceutical companies, there has to be an economic motive to take that forward, because it's very expensive to test these things. And there's no economic motive there. And that's why we didn't have things that were, close to ready to go. And we could have done it. And yet, I wonder whether we've learned the lesson, and we have looked around at other candidate diseases and said, we should be getting these up to that stage.
Such as?
Well, that's a good question. I'll ask my physician friend.
Well, you could say, I mean, I think many people will probably know that Ebola was around over decades. It was in small outbreaks, largely in Central Africa, and a few groups were developing a vaccine. There was no imperative, and then suddenly it exploded, and we needed it fast. You could argue similar things happening right now with Zika virus. That it was this mosquito-borne mild illness that we saw a little bit of first discovered in the 40s, and a little bit of it in Central Africa and Polynesia, and now it's spread. Where are we with, so you can't often...
But there's an endless list of those.
There's an endless
Well, it's
list.
not an endless list. I mean, we've had 2 instances of what we call coronaviruses coming into the human population from fruit bats. One was SARS and the other one is MERS, which is running at the moment.
Yep.
And it wouldn't be a bad idea, I think, to make a sort of generic antiviral against that class of viruses, which we could do. We've got generic antivirals against influenza. And that's one thing that is happening, so with influenza. We've had some antivirals, but there's whole new classes are being developed. Because we do know for certain we'll at some stage get another influenza pandemic. That's absolutely certain.
To take a step back, Norman, let's maybe have a think about the diseases and the outbreaks, which could be pandemics, which we don't even talk about. We're not even talking about tuberculosis in the same conversation as Zika. I find that incredible, that tuberculosis worldwide now could represent the next pandemic because it won't actually feature on a radio show or be on a morning television show.
You'll pick up on it, particularly with a politician he can roast.
Yeah, but the reality is, you're asking me to put budget. He's going to slam me on hospital waiting lists many, many, many times more than he's going to hit me on tuberculosis or even malaria.
Sell it to me.
Yeah.
Tuberculosis?
Here you go.
Tuberculosis?
No.
You just give it to
Tell
him
me
for free.
why I should be devoting the first an hour of my program to the debate about tuberculosis and what we should be doing in this country about it.
Without buying into the idea that health has to be a security concern now, which I'm a little bit against. Health in itself is an end for me. Tuberculosis...
Sorry, just before you... I'm usurping my colleague's right to interview you here, but before you glide off that little remark there, what do you actually mean?
Sorry?
What do you mean about health and security being
Part of the assumptions we're making here are that Ebola represented a security threat for the world. And Ebola, in March of 2014, it didn't represent the same threat. It was declared as a public health emergency. People realised it represented something quite difficult and challenging in West Africa, but it didn't have the same calamity as 6 months later, post or during the peak. For us, as Western white people, we saw it as something interesting but not relevant. Like we agree, it didn't reach our shores. It wasn't something that threatened us. But until we started recognising, oh, okay, that person from the Australian Red Cross actually came back last week and maybe they're unwell. Oh, that person actually has been away and now they're in quarantine. That it does represent something for us, whether that's security or health, it only became relevant then. The security element I find hard because that's...
So back to selling Neil on TV.
Shane Warne has got a new girlfriend.
Yeah.
Eddie Maguire's got a new TV program. Malcolm Turnbull and Tony Abbott are at war. Why does tuberculosis issue matter on my program?
If we care about people in the world the way that we should be caring about people who are unwell with illnesses outside of Australia and New Zealand, outside of this local context, because if we don't take care of it, it will come to us.
I've got people who can't get into hospital for hips and I've been in bed for 3 years.
And
they
in
can't
10
get
years,
treatment.
if there are no drugs that can take care of drug-resistant tuberculosis, they'll be in there with drug-resistant tuberculosis.
Okay, so it's coming to Australia.
It's already coming
It's here.
closer in New Guinea. I'm trying to sell it to you. I'm
He's not running a panel discussion here.
He's having fun not having fun.
So there's the security issue. It's a threat to Australia.
that's a health issue.
I think the point is, though, it shouldn't be news for morning TV. This is a long-term program. Even the issues around what we invest in our foreign aid budget is a long-term strategic decision. It's not something that we make to go on morning radio.
But TB is another classic where basically there's not a big economic motive for the drug companies. And they have to make a profit. I mean, they're businesses. So we've got a terrible situation in South Africa. We've got an extreme incidence of TB, particularly in a very high incidence of HIV-infected people. which, you know, if they're not getting drugs, they're immunosuppressed. We've got a very high incidence of total drug-resistant TB. That means there's no drug that touches this damn thing. And TB is a respiratory infection, and it does fly.
But I'd have thought the story for Neil is that they're just a tinny ride across the Torres Strait, this situation in Papua New Guinea.
Yeah.
Literally, a tinny and an outboard motor is where we get to multi-drug-resistant TB. So, but I'm just going to challenge you, Sharon, here, and I might bring in Michael as well, surely it is in our self-interest that we try and encourage health systems in place in poor countries, because it helps them, but it also helps us. I mean, if you look at the circulation of flu, it starts off in Asia, in poor countries, and then circulates in the Northern Hemisphere, then down to the Southern Hemisphere, and it comes back to those nations after the Northern Hemisphere, then comes down to us, and so on. We're as much subject to, I mean, that's the big pandemic that's coming, and it's going to come from poverty.
Yeah. President Bush worked out that even rich people get flu. I mean, it happens. Everyone gets flu. You can't decide not to breathe.
Can Donald Trump get flu? Sort of.
Probably not. I mean, you know.
You're absolutely right. But that gets back to this idea about protecting our shores, as therefore that's why we need to do something. But I do think that strengthening healthcare systems is absolutely key for what a country like Australia needs to be thinking about. And the other area, we've talked more on the politics here, but the other area that Australia can make a huge contribution is in the science, because, you know, we have better, easier drugs, we don't have a good vaccine against TB, amazingly enough, after it being a major problem for many years. You know, that's an area that's the long-term investment that we could make a contribution.
Is we've really got to be careful in this era of cost-cutting governments. We've really got to be careful that we don't cut our own public health capacity. I mean, it's not something you can transfer into the private sector.
We already have, of course.
Too late.
But I
considerably.
know, there's been a lot of people let
So
off.
what have we cut, Michael?
Well, we've cut prevention, you know, quite seriously, and we've now also cutting our capacity in terms of our public hospital system, and it's a public hospital system that deals with the people who are most vulnerable, those who've got the money. Right, and I'd actually like to go back a little bit, and Peter said, look, Ebola was never going to be a problem in Australia. Generally, I agree with him, with exception if it had wound up in Arayonga or Yuendamu or another remote community. Actually, we probably would have had quite a serious problem, and sometimes we forget that, and the same applying, of course, to tuberculosis. And sometimes we just forget that we actually have a particular vulnerability in Australia, and then the refugee and migrant population.
So what pandemic plans, anybody, do we have in place apart from influenza?
Look, the CDNA, what does it stand for? The Communicable Disease Network Australia, which is the arrangement between all the states and territories, and the Chief Medical Officer is there and does have pandemic plans in place for around Australia. Now, we argue that...
For what? Because they're all different.
For any outbreak, actually, and mostly they're concentrating on flu, I think would be right. We argue that actually we need a Centre for Disease Control for Australia, and the reason we need it more than anything is because there is always a financial struggle going on between the states and territories, and a cost shifting and so forth. Now, they have worked together on a number of outbreaks, and they've done actually quite well. But that struggle always exists, and actually I think we need to separate it and have the decisions made a little bit at arm's length from that, and that's what the CDC does in the United States. We don't need the full-blown thing that they do in the United States, but we need a better coordination, I think.
So Neil, were you shaking your head at another bureaucracy, were you?
No, I was thinking about HIV.
Yeah.
I was thinking about HIV and the whole discussion we're having here. And I mean, I read that we have lost focus, not medically or in research sense. Public interest has gone, and that dangerous practices are resuming. Is this right? And if so, why? Because we've got this sort of example, the tuberculosis thing happening at the moment, in a sense.
Well, I think in HIV in Australia, we have a situation where we've got a consistent number of new infections, about 1,000 new infections a year, which hasn't budged for a long time.
I thought Victoria was seeing an uptick.
Where Victoria is actually seeing a slight decrease at the moment, but recently has had an upswing, but we're in a position now where we actually can have access to new treatments for HIV, new ways to prevent HIV through something called PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis, an opportunity to really eliminate those new infections.
Is that
With
why,
HIV, yeah,
that's why it's gone from the public consciousness?
it has gone from the public consciousness in Australia because it's an infection that we can now treat quite easily with one tablet a day. That doesn't mean that getting HIV is a minor event in someone's life. It's a very major event in someone's life. Still a lot of stigma and discrimination. But we do have an opportunity to actually perhaps see the end of new HIV infections with some of these new interventions. I was also thinking about HIV though, because HIV was probably one of the few pandemics that really did make it here, and we had to have a coordinated response. And it was going back a long time now, but one of the key factors, I think, in the coordinated response was central leadership and coordination across the whole country, which engaged the scientists, government and community members. It was a really amazing model that came in the early 80s.
The bowling ball advertisements and Ida Burrows and everything else, and mum and baby dead.
Yeah, I would say in those early days we did get it right. I mean, probably, and one of the most important things that was done then, I've got Bill Botel looking at me, smiling away, because Bill was a key person in that, in fact, that advocacy around
David
getting
Pennington's
it right.
sitting over there, another person.
Yeah. So it wasn't that easy to get right at the time. You know, there was a lot of this sort of issue about talking about vulnerable populations and engaging community, but it was done, and probably the best thing that was done was access to clean needles. That was really revolutionary in Australia and not done anywhere else.
But look at our vulnerable populations. Still don't have them in prisons. Still can't get a needle and syringe program into a prison. It's actually
Do you know
appalling.
that Iran has needle exchange programs in prisons?
I certainly do, and I've seen their evaluation because I was in Iran and talked to the people who ran the evaluation, and actually the science was amazing. They started from the beginning to say this is what we're trying to achieve, and the interesting part about that particular one was they handed the needles out pretty well willy-nilly and counted how many came back. And in the first year it was around 90%, as my recollection, might have been 88 or something. But they brought that right up to something like 96% of returned needles in the second year as confidence built in the system.
And what, hepatitis C went down? And
HIV went down, hepatitis C went down very considerably.
But we don't want condoms in schools. How will we ever allow syringes or
We
needles
actually
in?
do allow condoms in prisons.
Yeah.
Although they
No
were a
politician would ever sell clean needles in prison, ever.
But we're not prepared to take on the prison officers.
Actually,
That's the issue.
you're not right. The Chief Minister in the ACT, Katie Gallagher, was actually very keen to do it. She was very public
she
about
get it
it
through?
and when she first as Health Minister. And we have a major problem with the union to just putting
the prison
a block
officers
into
who won't have
place.
it done.
The discussion is still continuing at this moment.
I think it's an issue with the public. They said you go to jail, you shouldn't be able to get drugs.
You shouldn't. We all agree you shouldn't, but they can.
Of course.
Yeah.
You know, one of the interesting things about HIV is because it's been going on so long, and unfortunately going on so long, is we have a lot of evidence-based ways of preventing and treating HIV. That's different than some of the new pandemics or the next pandemics as we're talking about. So what we have in HIV and AIDS is we have the luxury of having an entire toolbox available to prevent HIV, whether it's through drug use or through sexual behaviors or through blood, and those are available. So that's a really key piece of good pandemic planning and pandemic intervention. The trick is, how do you resell your program on AIDS, right? And HIV prevention. How do you resell that as still requiring intensive efforts to make sure these evidence-based practices can be used? In these other fields, and other diseases, we don't yet know how to deal with them when they hit. And they may not hit among identified populations or based on identified behaviors. It may be just being coughed on or sneezed on. And that piece needs some public discussion as well.
But it's still, there is a generic side to this, which is that if you've got strong health systems in place, so SARS was the nightmare pandemic where you really could catch it by touching the end of the bed. I mean, it really was a nasty infection. Luckily, the Middle Eastern version is not quite as infectious, but it was health systems in place that helped to control that. So if you've got health systems in place, it makes a difference.
I mean, the key thing with SARS, if you have the health system, the key thing with SARS was initially nobody knew what they were dealing with. And, the 1918 influenza virus pandemic, which killed maybe 50 million people. The flu virus wasn't isolated for another, I think it was 13 years. We knew it was influenza, we knew it was a virus, but you couldn't actually isolate the virus. When the SARS came along in 2002, we had the virus out within a couple of months. And I think technology is advanced now so that if we got something like that happening right now, we'd probably have it out in a couple of weeks. And
It's happening in Ebola, actually. I mean, of course, what was needed was health system strengthening. It wasn't sequencing of the virus. It was happening in real time.
So once they identified the virus, then they discovered that it survives on surfaces and that people are very infectious late, which they didn't expect because that's not like influenza. Once they understood it, they stopped it immediately, just by barrier nursing. So the essential is to understand what you're dealing with quickly.
Peter, you may or may not remember, but you and Rolf Zinkernagel took part in a late line that I chaired, and David Baltimore was on the panel. And you probably don't remember, but I do remember this. I asked the panel, on national television, what keeps you up at night? And what kept David Baltimore up at night was smallpox. And coming to a security, this is not on the agenda now, but we have ISIS, Daesh, what are you going to call them, completely, they're not mad, they're evil. Are we still vulnerable to biological warfare to create new pandemics?
It's possible. I mean, but actually the best bioterror weapon we've ever seen was anthrax. It was just sent through the mail. It's a fantastic bioterror weapon. People get really frightened.
But email solved that, right?
But email has solved it. But you can't get a virus.
You've never had an email from Peter Doherty.
That's not the same thing. Yeah, so sure, but we do know how to handle smallpox, and we'd sort of handle it fairly quickly. You get a nasty outbreak somewhere, something unpleasant would happen. I mean, I sort of go through scenarios. I've been writing books that nobody reads, and I think about writing a novel. I think about writing a novel with a mad scientist, and then I think, really we need any more mad scientists?
The zombie apocalypses have already been written. Yeah.
I'm afraid so.
And actually, it's about also, I think, how you die. And that's one of the things about Ebola. The picture of blood coming from ears, nose, orifices, dying in that manner. And you raised the fear issue before, and I think there was a huge additional element around that as well.
I'd argue you have to have an element of fear. And you mentioned this before about receiving that correspondence from someone who didn't believe Ebola existed. It was all a figment of someone's imagination. I'm not saying that you should have the hysteria, but there needs to be a sense of fear about some of these things because we become complacent, and that's reflected in pertussis immunisation rates in Australia at the moment. That's reflected in our idea of disease being something that we can prevent.
I understand what you're saying here, but Neil, surely that creates risk in generating that fear because you unleash a monster. And the fear can say, well, this is a conspiracy of the international pharmaceutical industry. It's an escaped virus from a vaccine lab. We've been giving monkeys these viruses and it's escaped. I mean,
I heard that.
Yeah, that's right. You wrote the script.
In the fluoride, yeah. But if we're talking about HIV earlier, if we got it right, that was a fear campaign initially.
Well, I think at the beginning, though, just like we were hearing with SARS, there were all these unknowns. So at the very beginning, there were these unknowns with HIV. It was unknown how it was transmitted until you developed a good test and you could screen the blood and you understood transmission risk. There was no treatment. There was a lot of unknowns.
But are we saying that couldn't happen again with something we don't yet know about?
What was good at that very beginning was that a lot of people learned about it very quickly through those
But Neil makes a fair point. Couldn't it happen, a state of ignorance which perpetuates? I mean, we're relying on science to give us quick answers.
There was enormous real fear, though, initially in the stage of HIV because we didn't know what it was. And how long did it take to get the virus isolated? It was a couple of years.
Couple of years.
So for
there
2 years,
there were all these crazy theories.
For 2 years, we didn't know what this thing was, and it was killing people horribly. And there was all sorts of wacky ideas out there. It was people who are taking drugs, and they're all, there's always the blame game.
The moral element.
There's always the blame game. That's the thing about flu. You know, you can't blame anyone. But with HIV, you can always blame people for behaviour and stuff. And it's disgusting, but it happens.
I don't know, we're able to blame the drug users, we're able to blame the gay community. It won't surprise me if we'll think that something has come from ISIS and we'll blame the Muslim community next. That blame plays an important role in the way we perceive things as well, particularly when it's vulnerable community, them, not us.
But we've demonised, we've used pandemics to demonise for time immemorial, for centuries.
Absolutely.
So it could happen again.
That's exactly the point. What's the new form of witches?
So how do you achieve then an element of constructive fear without panic?
Sure.
Me.
Well, you started the fear. You started this fear thing.
I think a good...
Just be careful, I'll unleash Neil on you. So
I'm studying public health at the moment, so this is like a test. I think there needs to be a good communications campaign like the HIV/AIDS campaign of the 80s in Australia. There needs to be an understanding that good science communicators can get out there and at least explain what we know and what we don't know and be transparent. And I think if there's a sense of secrecy around this, it can be blown up very easily, a sense of an opaque system that can't be challenged. If people understand that scientists, doctors, medical professionals don't know everything, but they're working on it 24/7, I think they can probably get it a little bit better than everything's going to be fine.
Jeremy, you talk about trade-offs in this sort of situation. When you talk about trade-offs, what do you mean?
Well, when I was listening to Stuart, the thing that I was thinking about was transparency. And one of the ethical values that's brought to pandemic planning is transparency and openness about that, in addition to taking evidence-based measures. So we mentioned that piece. What do we know scientifically? What do we know that works and what doesn't work? The next piece is to be open as can be about it. One of the problems that stalled efforts during the early part of the AIDS epidemic was the thoughts about secrecy. And there were concerns that there were conspiracy theories behind the transmission of HIV. We forget those stories. But what happened by openness and the more transparent that governments and scientists became with communities who were affected mostly by HIV, there began to be energized communities. So you were able to identify communities on the plus side. You did a quick list. We called it the 4-H Club in the United States. Homosexuals, heroin addicts, Haitians because of the Haiti outbreak, hemophiliacs because of the blood issue. But you had communities that were identifiable. And on the one hand, that energized response, and on the other hand, led to some stigma. And the stigma lingers, which is hugely problematic for a disease that's spread like many other diseases. So the piece, transparency and evidence are part of the things you want to bring to bear as you priority set.
But of all those communities you talked about, there was really only one strong community, which was gay men with HIV. That was a very strong community that coalesced and was incredibly powerful.
Oh, globally,
We don't have that. We don't have that sort of community around many problems that arise in pandemics.
right? The people to get Ebola or Zika, right?
When there was all that fear about the possibility of a bird flu pandemic, it never happened, but there was great concern about it, and a lot of information went out, and a lot of groups were having their pandemic plan well set up. School groups, school districts in the US, and so forth. And then, of course, when the fear goes away, these things get put on a dusty shelf. The person responsible forgets he or she is responsible, and the whole thing goes away again. It's just what we are as human beings. And so it does need that fear element probably to ramp up. Yeah.
I think you've got to choose the right person to do the communicating. So in Australia or the US, we respect institutions and governments to some extent, and scientists to some extent, but in what was fascinating about Ebola was that it was in a country which had enormous distrust of their governments, incredible corruption. It wasn't until they really used community leaders that they could actually get the message across. It's the same thing with HIV in many parts of the world. You need to engage communities that then can deliver the message, that there's a lot of suspicion around governments, scientists, etc. And these conspiracy theories still exist. I'm reading some brilliant ones about Zika.
Yeah,
that they're all there. That it's a pesticide. That it's the this manipulation of mosquitoes was as a strategy to eliminate dengue was actually transmitting Zika. That all the conspiracy theories.
Part of the issues that contribute to pandemics spreading and not being handled well are cultural issues, or the kinds of things we don't want to talk about. incredibly. So in Ebola, the part of the community, the problem with Ebola was the burial practices, the cultural practice of burial was very different from that was required to incinerate the bodies or really bury them. So these burial practices were totally antithetical to what the community believed in. And so to convince a community that the way you've been doing this for hundreds or thousands of years is wrong, and that wrongness is really a cultural clash. Similarly in HIV, the discussion of once we realized it was sexually transmitted, could be sexually transmitted, the idea about talking about safer sex practices, which now we can almost say with some people going like this, but if you remember the early campaigns that someone would talk about a condom outside of, a strange appearance of a condom on a movie was really bizarre. You can probably tell I'm American. One of the, when I
Very brave of you to admit it.
these days it's there's a lot of stigma. When I had one of my first jobs, I had a very distinguished Southern secretary. So in the south of the United States, the more conservative part of our state, which you may see by different colors of states on television, I had a very conservative secretary who insisted on being called a secretary because she said if I called her an assistant, she said, if you abbreviate that, honey, it's quite unsavory. So I was doing some work on international HIV prevention, and I had some different marketing materials that were around to talk about safer sex, and this was in the mid-90s. So one of the campaigns that was most successful was in San Francisco. They put a poster on the buses in San Francisco of two young men naked except for a flag and a condom. And she had that up, and she had it hung over her desk. She goes, "Oh, aren't they adorable?" And when we got to the point that my secretary, Barbara, could say that that was adorable instead of horrible, I knew we were going to make some progress.
That's about leadership.
Let's just talk about some of the things that are going on that create the environment in which pandemics occur. I mean, I'm thinking of foodborne illnesses. I mean, there's stuff that goes on that you might not classify by your pandemic definition. In thousands of cases and many deaths from foodborne illness, salmonella, pathogenic E. coli, and so on, which are created by, my understanding is the way we grow and market food. I mean, and how much are we attending to our broader industrial environment as a source of new pandemics?
Look how quickly government responds to some frozen berries that make 100 people sick and kill half a dozen. And they respond quickly. They respond quickly, and they're going to label where our food comes from because that's them and us. And yet, to get labelling on the front pack of food to tell you how nutritious it is when we're losing how many people to obesity and so on. It's such a marked contrast because there's also an element of this happens quickly and people slowly dying, a bit like the boiling frog. That's not such good politics.
So, Peter, are you prepared to say that cardiovascular disease is a pandemic?
Well, if it is, we're doing a lot better with it, Norman, since the statins, despite one ABC TV program.
Nothing to do with me, officer. And I still use my mobile phone.
My father and grandfather were dead at 47 and 48, and I've been taking these things forever. No, I think it's basically a physiological process that many, if you go back a generation beyond me, which is 3 generations beyond many of you, you will find that many, say, prominent scientists were dead by 70 because of heart attacks, and many prominent people right across the community. And now, of course, we're living much longer. It's one of the big things.
But let me just pursue it a little bit, because there's this whole network theory and 6 degrees of separation, that if you're fat, you are actually influencing people to be obese. 6 degrees of separation from you, that you influence the social networks around you. It almost behaves as if it's an infectious disease. Social networks.
Well, I think it's infectious in the sense of all the fructose and the corn syrup that's being put into foodstuffs. And it's very hard in the US, for instance, often to actually buy food that doesn't have corn syrup in, right? And, part of the obesity epidemic is what's being put in food.
Now, Sharon, you spend your life talking about viruses. What about bacteria? I mean, Stuart talked about tuberculosis. What other bacteria should we be concerned
Yeah, I think actually the big threat is antimicrobial resistance, or bacteria that are resistant to multiple drugs. So we've all grown up in a world where we have antibiotics and we think that we can treat any new infection. And we're seeing more and more cases of bugs that are resistant to all known antibiotics. And they are often a result of how, and again, this is another great example of how we need to worry about what's happening in countries other than our own, because many countries don't regulate antibiotic use at all, and you can use very, very powerful antibiotics for very minor infections. You have higher rates of organisms that circulate that are highly resistant. They come in you can actually pick these bugs up by changing the bugs that colonise your bowel, and then you come in and you have an operation and you can get sick from one of these resistant organisms. So the WHO has actually labelled antimicrobial resistance. And companies, if you look historically at all the investment in new drugs, very little investment in antibacterial agents. That's probably going to change, but there's been very few new antibiotics
We
around.
wanted an authoritative voice on it. We should get Liz Hartland up on the stage. She's a bacteriologist.
Yeah,
But
we have
I think, again, one of the problems was that antibiotics, there was no real profit motive in it for the drug companies to develop new antibiotics.
Yeah.
And then more recently, we've had organisations like Gates Foundation come back in and say we've got to put a lot more money into this. But that's part of it. It's this business of developing drugs. There's got to be an economic motive there. And so if the drug companies can't find it, we've got to help in some way to get that
Actually, there's a
done.
reverse economic motive because they were selling them very broadly, last-line antibiotics in animal prophylactic animal care, and of course we're going to.
Yeah, I know.
have
I mean,
problems,
they're put in, say, pig food.
Exactly.
And I think it's the Netherlands that doesn't admit any pig farmer who comes in with an infection into a general ward. They keep them isolated because they're worried about multi-drug resistant staph or something of that sort. So it is a real issue. It's not a pandemic issue, I think.
I think it is, and I think that's one of the issues that we have to include in discussing a pandemic. It's about money. A lot of what happened to do with Ebola was about money. It was about economic systems collapsing in a region of a continent. It was about economic systems potentially being affected in the Western world. The same, you could argue, is happening with tuberculosis. We're starting to realise it's going to possibly affect our economic system as well. And the other part is drug development. It's still disturbing. I say the same thing, that to develop a drug, it costs a lot of money. It shouldn't. And there should be systems around that, whether it's through the WHO or other guidelines and frameworks that can allow for drugs to be developed for just the development of the drug, not to make a profit. And it's
Isn't
maybe
that
a crazy
just totally
idea.
naive?
Well, I hope not, but that's one of the hopes about antimicrobial resistance. That's got to be one of the hopes, because that's not going to make money.
Well, so the thing to add to the list is stewardship of antibiotics use. So the piece that we all have an obligation to take care of, if as a practicing physician, if someone comes in with what appears to be a viral syndrome, requests an antibiotic because they want to get better.
But that comes
How
back
do
to
I do that?
But there's
that's
no
a-
antibiotic stewardship in India. And people go and visit India and come back with multi-resistant organisms. And isn't that another case for health security being something that we should be considering and helping others to put health systems in place?
I totally agree, but we have to solve all of the problem at once. So it's not simply just the India problem. Because that problem is so big, we can't solve some of it at home. I think a start comes with in the individual interactions of doctors and patients. What does that mean? And as patients, what are our expectations to receive an antibiotic that may not be, in my best interest or in the community's best interest? And trading that off is a hard sell. So if it's hard enough in the clinic room in Melbourne, what's it like in New Delhi or Bangalore is going to be another issue. But
Get back to Stuart's point, though, on the funding of new drugs. If it isn't the drug company, if it isn't the profit motive that drives it, what is it? Is it public money? It's the only other option, isn't it?
It should be public money.
How much? I mean, you can't get enough money to research anything in this country at the moment.
That's true, and that's why the international framework needs a good revision right now, because these systems
What
don't
do you mean by
exist at all.
international framework?
The international framework, the WHO, the idea that drug companies are profit only, that they can, it's not a public good necessarily, these kind of ideas. Certainly in Médecins Sans Frontières, we're trying to develop through a couple of our networks in Geneva and internationally about pushing the WHO to consider more open ideas. And not necessarily the idea that a pharmaceutical has to make money. Of course, they've got to make money so that they can provide jobs.
But in the end, isn't the private sector the best sector for producing products and doing it efficiently? I mean, what WHO has been talking about is actually giving them longer patent life or, easier regulation.
What we've been seeing is successive amalgamations in drug companies where they fire their whole research division. They become more and more channels for taking things from, say, public science. And the drug companies that have kept their research division up, like Novartis, have actually done a lot better, I think.
There are some interesting...
So it's the magic of the markets at work,
I think
Great, it'll kill us all, but still.
There are some interesting
Should be on
models
catalyst.
around public-private partnerships, which are happening in malaria, for example, the malaria medicines venture. They're happening in TB, where you often need leadership from good government that can then bring in the private sector, bring in the public sector, and then create an arrangement that it's attractive for private companies to invest. There's a whole lot of work you can do with drugs that have been developed but then sit on the shelf and never been applied, so that can be repurposed for other. So there is quite a bit happening in that space, particularly in malaria and TB.
Is there a model for that? Does it happen anyway?
Yeah. There's something. Malaria and TB are two good examples. We don't yet have a fantastic outcome. Actually, TB, there's been some good new drugs developed through that model because you're not going to interest the private sector to invest, but there are a lot of governments that are.
But it's required a billionaire to put in money.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Well, Gates, of course, has done that in his own way through the Gates Foundation, and that's what you're talking about. But the MMV was not largely driven by Gates. It was led by the Netherlands government.
That's why we consider this conversation. It's now your turn as well. So let's put up house lights so that I can see the audience a bit better. And raise your hands if you want to come in for anything. There's somebody down here already, but carry on. What did you want to say there?
I was just going to, the drug company says that it costs $1 billion to bring a drug to market. And they write off all sorts of other costs. For instance, the money they use on the drugs they don't bring to market. Also, from one experience I had, for instance, the cost of taking the helicopter to lunch, the Bronwyn Bishop moment.
You had to get that in, didn't you? Yeah. Yes.
We seem to be bumping up against this economic argument all the time. Can we make a parallel with the security that we have in the army? What is the return on the funds that we spend in the army and the facilities there? Surely you've suggested we need a generic approach to coronaviruses, and that we should be investing in that area. Surely these are strategic investments which are not at all expected to have an immediate return on funds.
You're sort of creating an analogy with the military that we make a strategic investment there for our physical security, that we make a strategic investment in terms of military security, we make a strategic investment in terms of our health security.
Yes, exactly so.
We just don't do that, though.
But why not?
Because we are programmed to think about bad guys. We're not programmed to think about bad bugs. Think of the response to climate change. It's just not in our program to do this.
Well, we've got a chap over here who's very good at generating bad guys and bad bugs. Come on, Mike. Come on, Mitch.
Bad bugs go away.
Anti-bug.
Yes.
Yeah, well, how do you do it? Yeah.
Yes, any other comments, questions? Yes.
I'll probably, I'll just, in 2016, my comments directed to Mike Morwell. I think it's terrible we're talking about Indigenous health in the same breath that we're talking about some of the poorest countries in the world. And I think we have to fix that in 2016. You can't have Ebola coming into Indigenous communities and having the same problems we're going to have in Africa. And maybe one way of approaching it is that scare the hell out of the white politicians that we've got to fix the Indigenous culture's health system or it's going to affect us. But we've got to do something. That's completely unacceptable, I think.
Look, I think it's incredibly embarrassing the way we treat refugees, but it's much, much more embarrassing the way we have an Indigenous population within our nation that has the health issues that it does, and we almost casually about it. And it's not that it's not for a lack of intention. It's about the leadership that we need in the area, and you see people like Tom Calma creating Close the Gap and so forth. It's great leadership. We just got to get everybody behind them.
I was lucky enough to interview the late Fred Hollows not long before he died, and if anybody spent half their life trying to wake white politicians up to the problems of Indigenous Australians, it was him, and he had some success. So maybe there's that model for doing it.
But of course, it's not necessarily, we keep on coming back to the same theme, it's not necessarily a medical solution.
Precisely. It's actually not so much a medical solution. It's about housing and education and leadership and the community themselves, and not acting on them, working with them for the solutions, which was the big problem with the Northern Territory intervention.
But you certainly don't want to create a health security issue to frighten people into doing something about Aboriginal health.
I'd be pretty well game to do almost anything to get. No, you're right. We don't want to frighten people into it, but let's push the envelope as far as we can.
Check in with a few Aboriginal leaders before you.
Yeah, shame people.
Any other comments or questions? Yes, over here.
It was sort of touched on before in terms of sort of preempting these disease spreads, sort of, in terms of how we farm, the agricultural sector. A lot of what I feel doesn't get talked about is how actually these horrible diseases such as Ebola sort of actually come to be. And I think there's a lot of talk about the last Ebola strain coming from contaminated bushmeat that had come from poor ecological systems that have gotten out of whack, and deforestation and just general disregard of our environment. Do you think that that's something that needs to be talked about more and more awareness?
Very good question, Sharon. Origins of emerging diseases?
I think changes in how we live and climate change have been huge factors. People that move into cities, deforestation, changing animal habitats, and then the issue around climate change I think is very real now with mosquito-borne viruses and the areas in which the mosquitoes that can transmit these viruses can now live. So I think the environmental changes are really significant in the drivers of new and emerging infectious diseases.
Well, what we're talking about with bushmeat is killing non-human primates for food in Africa.
That's always been
So
the case.
again, it's a function of poverty, because this is a fairly substantial component of actually high protein.
And greed.
And some African communities, and greed. And basically that's probably how HIV jumped across from chimps. And it's certainly a good candidate for Ebola, because Ebola is also killing the chimps and gorillas, and not just people.
And in Australia, we'll see Hendra emerging from bats, and that's an environmental issue as well. I wonder how many more diseases are going to come from bats as they get displaced, as well, they lose their normal habitat.
Never forget the phrase by Sir Roy Porter, the late medical historian, who said, whenever we change the way we live, new diseases arise, and it absolutely runs true through history. Yes, a comment here, and then we'll come to Bill Botel.
Thinking about the international architecture, and I think Stuart touched on it, I wonder how the members of the panel who have dealings with WHO would rate its performance over the last 10, 20 years, stretching back to HIV, and what, if anything, needs to be done to invigorate and upgrade the performance of the international architecture for dealing with these problems, as we know they will arise.
Sure. MSF has not been known for its close relationship with the World Health Organization.
We're not the best of friends. Certainly, and in the last 2 years, we've been extremely critical of what happened in West Africa. Our dealings with the WHO and the architecture generally are quite limited, and we tend to push and advocate where we can, and do so understanding that we're up against a massive bureaucracy, which is at the behest of the member states and doesn't maybe have the power that it should or could. So we find it limiting. So we end up working on a very local or regional level as opposed to much more global level with the WHO.
But isn't it patchy? The problem with Africa was that the African office of the WHO was pathetic, whereas SARS was an example of WHO performing well, where it wasn't the African office.
It's easy to say that. I think there are also concerns about budgeting and resourcing in the headquarters for WHO in terms of emergency response. They didn't have their head in the right way. to deal with a response for Ebola in the way that they should have. Look, there's a lot of factors. We think they need to reform internally and certainly have a much better disaster response, emergency response unit that's funded and resourced. That's one of the basics if we're talking about pandemics alone. If we're talking about general health policy and architecture, that's another session completely. But we try.
There is a recent effort that's been launched by the National Academy of Science and Medicine in the United States. That's a global effort to look at what is, I think, globally perceived to be failure of the WHO with Ebola. And they just issued a bunch of reports which are available free to download under the Institute of Medicine. National Academy of Medicine now just rebranded in the last few months. That looks at the need for a different perspective on global health governance, also financing issues about
It was never thus. I mean, the World Bank for a while was taking over the role of WHO because WHO was falling apart under Nakajima.
Right.
And I heard Angela Merkel in the World Health Assembly in May last year saying actually 3/4 of the problem is that the member states aren't providing the funding, and actually then put her money where she was. So, you know, I think sometimes it's really easy to point the finger there as well. But if the member states are A, putting restrictions around, and that was part of it, B, not giving the appropriate funding, then of course the WHO is not going to be able to do the job.
Peter?
Yeah, well, global aid budgets are down everywhere, aren't they, really? But one place where the WHO does well is in the Global Influenza Network. And partly because a lot of that is actually funded within the different states. For instance, we have a World Health Organization Influenza Reference Centre here, one of 6, I think, worldwide. I can never remember whether it's 5 or 6. But our government pays for that. And it was really that the WHO Influenza Network which got onto SARS. It was because initially they thought it was flu. So you got a lot of high-powered scientists coming into it very quickly, and they sorted it out as something quite different very fast.
But even when member states are giving money to the WHO, they're doing it now in restricted ways. Yeah. And so the WHO actually doesn't have the flexibility to be able to operate in the way an organisation like that should. So it's not all about the WHO, it's also about the interference of the member states. And I've got to say, Australia's been playing this game as well quite heavily, as has the US and so forth.
So I don't know what Bill was aiming for. He's probably aiming for a cheap shot at WHO, but let's move beyond. It's not just WHO, it's the World Bank and others. It's even MSF. I mean, do we have the right architecture in place? You know, for example, the World Bank's been criticised as well by wanting to put in expensive health infrastructure, which is inappropriate in poorer countries.
Just so the World Federation of Public Health Associations has just worked with the WHO, and we're about to publish in the next couple of weeks, it's been accepted for publication, a charter for the public's health, which is actually about health promotion, protection and prevention. And it's a coordinated effort. So I see a positive way of working with a small number of people in the WHO, but that's not a structural issue.
And the bank goes off and does its own thing.
Indeed, yeah.
So how do we bring them together? We're a member of the World Bank as much as we're a member of the World Health Organization.
What you do normally is you vote me or Bill in as the beneficent dictator of the world, and you've got no problem.
Yeah. Or Neil.
Well, one example, I mean, Peter gave a good example of, well, how WHO works with flu, but, you know, there are some in targeted responses in HIV. You know, the Global Fund for HIV, tuberculosis and malaria has been a very successful initiative. You know, UNAIDS, another specific division around within the UN to actually specifically advocate for HIV. Now, you can't replicate this in every disease, but there have been some models that have been a little bit more nimble and probably highly effective.
The fundamental problem still is a small percentage of the world's population own 80% of the world's money, you know, and actually until we resolve that, I'm going to feel like I'm going to be a communist shortly. But until we resolve that problem in a sensible way.
You and Bernie Sanders.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
A lot of these discussions today have revolved around sort of retrospective analyses of diseases such as, or pandemics such as HIV and Ebola, with the privilege of a 2020 hindsight. Do you think that responses would have been improved if we'd had a significantly better understanding of the potential implications, or would it be basically caught up in politics and other mitigating factors?
Question, Sharon, do you want to pick it up?
So I guess the question is, are we better prepared for new... Could we respond better now if having learnt what we had in the past? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly. I mean,
Well, I think,
if we could predict things better, does it make a difference?
I think Zika is not a bad example here. So we're right in the middle of this new, learning a lot about this new virus. It doesn't have the same impact on mortality, of course, that TB and HIV and others have, but it has got significant morbidity associated with it. It was, happening in this very poor part of the world, and no one really was paying too much attention until someone returned to the US and was pregnant with and carrying the virus. Now, the WHO response has been totally different. Of course, it comes off on the back of Ebola, but I think, and they may or may
So they've been accused of overreacting.
Yeah, now they're accused of overreacting, so you can't always get it right. But I think we are slowly learning some principles. I thought actually tonight we might discuss what will be the next pandemic, and I've been thinking, you often can't read it. We know that flu, I know Peter often says, and I agree with that, flu is always going to be around, and it's the most likely, but this could come from anywhere. Who could have dreamt up HIV at the very beginning? Zika, there are tons of viruses that we know are extremely rare, and some of our experts know a whole lot about them, but who would have predicted that Zika would suddenly become so big and now linked with this complication of microcephaly? So I think we just don't know where it's going to come from, but some of the principles I think we're learning a bit better, and maybe from the really bad mistakes, we do need much better global structures to manage it.
From an MSF point of view, to answer your question, probably the flip side. We see it a little bit more pessimistically. The architecture is the same, more or less, that there are some changes, but there's maybe some learnings. We're not 100% sure. And in MSF, we know that the next meningitis outbreak, a la Katanga of 2015, will not be dealt with by the Western world until it meets the Western world. So we're a little bit pessimistic that there are outbreaks which are potential pandemics, which will not even be on the radar until we know about it in our mainstream media. And unfortunately, we see it a little bit darkly like that, which is why we're trying to push the architecture point. We're trying to push the fact that patients still need treatment as much as the surveillance network needs to be strong, as much as health systems need to be strengthened.
Yes.
Hi, you touched on it briefly before, the cultural barriers that can exist in pandemic situations, especially in rural communities. I'm just wondering how you overcome those barriers and how you sort of sustain that so it doesn't go back to how it was before.
Which, of course, is an ethical issue, Jeremy. We'll come to the technical side in a minute.
I think the essential thing is to get all the people of influence on side. For instance, early in this HIV pandemic in Africa, I think Senegal organised extremely well, as I recall. It pulled all the organs of influence together, the politicians, the Islamic leaders and so forth, and they all sang from the same hymn sheet. And I think that's enormously important, is to get everyone. And the same thing happened in Thailand when they realised they had a massive HIV epidemic. The military, everyone of influence, the king got involved, and they toned it down fairly quickly.
Where does the media fit into that then? And the
media,
public?
the media are absolutely
and
central.
how I get a sense of distrust from the scientific community, to me personally, of course, but towards the media, and perhaps even a sense that the public wouldn't understand, and the media we can't trust to tell them. That's dealing with people around this town privately. They don't trust the media or the public.
Yeah, interesting you say that, because the media, I think, is absolutely key. So that how to get your message out, how do you get your... and that's absolutely key. And I think the other thing that... the other key bit of it was community engagement. So getting the, talking and engaging affected communities.
But I think that...
So what's the barrier to this, getting over this trust issue with the media?
I don't know. I mean, the media...
Well, you can't only sell fear. Right? So part of it is how do you trust what's the trusted voice in news, right? And how can you use the skills, which are really hard to learn and use, to mobilize that resource to be able to engage the people who are most infected in a conversation about the things that affect them most. So part of it is, it's not just the broadcasting out of a story, a science story. It's not just a science story. The reason it's cultural is because it's a local story. And the local voices need to be heard about what the actual cultural practices are, and then those need to iterate with a way of figuring out what the right response is.
But we've sidestepped the question, because the question was, and acknowledged what you said, Peter, which is that you create these pieces of infrastructure, social infrastructure, which are resilient to the extent of the epidemic in question, but then dissipate afterwards without this coalescing force of fear. And how do you sustain that in between times? I think that was part of your question.
The example we had in West Africa, which was successful with our teams during and after the peak, not so much in the beginning, was a community engagement strategy, essentially, getting people out there, communicating what the disease was, what it represented, talking about burial practices, talking about how it could affect you and your community, but what to do if you got a fever, what to do if you became unwell. The other part of that, and I mix it a little with cultural, is the gender issue. Certainly in West Africa, women were a vulnerable population particularly, and that was something that our teams recognised quite well, understanding that if the mother of a family became unwell, that had significant impact in that whole family and community structure. So we tried to listen and understand the people the best we could, not thinking for them what they needed to know, but trying to ask them. The other part, which was amazing, was we used survivors, Ebola survivors, as part of our teams. And in that way, the communities could actually know someone who had the disease and survived, and the fact that you don't die 100% of the time. That was quite powerful.
Yes.
So,
just keep talking.
It's more of a comment than a question, but it kind of answers a question that was raised earlier. But there was also some degree of luck involved in any kind of response strategy, and in relation to the Lagos episode with Ebola, just by chance, WHO, and I'm not singing WHO's praises, but WHO had a team of 200 or 300 polio contact tracers on the ground in Lagos at that time, which were then redeployed to do Ebola contact tracing immediately after they identified that there was healthcare to healthcare transmission. So they did ring contact tracing of all the contacts and kept doing concentric rings out from all those contacts, and had basically 20,000 contact traces done within 2 weeks, which limited it to 20 people being infected in Lagos.
Yes, thank you for that comment, really instructive.
Hi, you touched on it briefly about animal agriculture and perhaps bats and bushmeat being a source of outbreak. What changes do you think we should make to the Australian agricultural system in order to prevent antibiotic resistance and outbreaks from happening?
You're the one who writes books.
I
the Nobel Prize has to mean something.
I mean, the measure of that, yeah, the measure of that would be how much multi-drug resistant bacterial infection we're seeing coming in from the community. So, Liz?
Well, it's more common than in hospitals, isn't it, Elizabeth?
No, I think we are seeing some of it, yeah.
In part, I don't think we know, because we don't monitor food that comes into the country, and we don't monitor animals for antibiotic resistant that come into the country. So we can only monitor people if they turn up with an antibiotic resistant
But isn't
infection.
it true, coming to Peter's point, that most antibiotic resistance these days comes into hospitals from outside and not generated from within hospitals? Studies in Western Australia in particular, and I think some studies in Victoria, that community-acquired antibiotic resistance is the most common form of antibiotic resistance.
I think that's true of certain infections like Staphylococcus infections, but it's not true of other gram-negative infections that are still generated in hospitals and spread around hospitals on equipment and through procedures, invasive procedures.
So changing to agri-practice, you want to buy into that?
I'm not really close enough to it to really be able to comment seriously on it.
But it is an important issue.
It is an important issue.
In the United States, it's a real issue in terms of foodborne disease.
And of course, it's a sensitive issue because it gets at economics and business.
And certainly within our organisation, I've heard people talking about the importance of the changes that have mostly already been made, where we're not using antibiotics in animals prophylactically, we're actually using them to treat specific disease rather than to
as a growth
make
promoter.
sure, rather than as a preventive
Did you want to
measure.
answer this
But
question?
if we're importing food from areas where there is antibiotic or there's no regulation of antibiotic usage, then those antibiotic-resistant bacteria are in animals, and they can be propagated through our food system with sort of global delivery of, some food sources.
You mean the countries that don't have the nanny state?
I'll take one more point over here, yes.
Just touching a little bit on pop culture and science fiction, there are quite a few suggestions that what will cause the next great extinction, and some of them are like nuclear war or an asteroid hitting the Earth. And one of the most popular ones is a pandemic or an epidemic that will just wipe out us from the face of the Earth, which is quite blessing, I guess. But how likely is that there's a disease that will kill us all and just save the planet?
Glad you're having a lot of fun on social media. I'm sure.
I think that the possibility of a pandemic sort of wiping out the human population it's just not going to happen. Even in the worst epidemic we know about, which is the Black Death, with the plague coming to England, in the 14th century, total ignorance of what was causing it. We had a terrible situation. A half to a third of the population died, but it didn't wipe out human beings. And I don't think an infection will do that. Especially since...
But climate change will come close.
You know the situation in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where everyone died because they fired all the people who sanitised telephone handsets? Well, we've solved that. We've got mobile phones, so we don't have to worry about that.
But everybody's going to get brain cancer, according to
I think the greatest risk that really worries us is a substantially dysfunctional world due to climate change, with widespread starvation, food stress, political and social stress. We're already seeing some of this, I think, in the Middle East, and the possibility of nuclear war. I think nuclear war is...
Yes, just a good way to finish with Donald Trump with his finger on the button. Could you please thank our fantastic panel?
I'd also like to thank this wide-ranging discussion, from Ebola to Zika to flu, HIV, drug-resistant bacteria, food safety, and even obesity. So they've given us their knowledge and their very frank opinions, and are wonderful communicators on these subjects. So please thank again Peter Doherty, Sharon Lewin, Norman Swan, Neil Mitchell, Jeremy Sugarman, Michael Moore, and Stuart Condon. Is thank you all for being here tonight. This is a really wonderful event where the public can engage with scientists and public health specialists and clinicians. And it's really a fantastic opportunity to understand the type of work that goes on in this area and how important it is, and how we have so much to worry about now that we mightn't have been worrying about this afternoon. I'd really like to thank also Convergence Science for putting on this event and helping us to run all these events that bring the public in contact with scientists, and also to thank the Club Melbourne Ambassador Program for sponsoring this event. So thank you all again, and good night.